Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast, where I get to interview global leaders and have fantastic conversations, and we get to take advantage of their wisdom and perspective on all things life and leadership. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Aliza Knox. Welcome, Aliza.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm delighted to be here.
So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off with your bio for people that haven't had the pleasure of meeting you before. Let me share with them who I'm talking to. So, Aliza Knox, the best-selling author of Don't Quit Your Day Job, built and led APAC businesses for three of the world's top technology firms, Google, Twitter, and Cloudflare. Named APAC IT Woman of the Year, she spent decades as a global finance and consulting executive. Aliza now has a portfolio career and as a non-executive board director shares her passion and lessons learned with the next generation of business leaders, guiding companies across new frontiers. She's also a senior advisor for BCG and a columnist for Fords. Aliza, brilliant to have you here with me this morning. For our audience, who are you as a human being?
I think that's a good question. Sometimes I ask myself that, but I would say, what are the things that describe me? I'm an exec, a mom of now grown kids, and a travel addict. There is nothing I like better than to go see places I haven't been and to go back to some places that I have been that are just amazing.
Fantastic. And this morning you're joining me from
Singapore.
Singapore. And Singapore's been home for quite some time for you, hasn't it?
Yeah, for 23 years about.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Aliza, let's get into an overview of your career and background, which is just really rich and wonderful. But let's step through your story and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Okay, so the concise version, having been a software executive, is that I can tell my career as a series of software releases. So Aliza 1.0 was primarily the Boston Consulting Group with a focus on financial services, and then Visa and Schwab and a bank in that period. And then, as we like to say in tech, I pivoted, and Aliza 2.0 was tech. So Google, Twitter, and Cloudflare, running all or most of Asia for those three companies. And then Aliza 3.0, which started during COVID, sort of, I think that was a period that led to changes for a lot of people, was or is trying to figure out what to do when I grow up. And for the time being, it's a portfolio career. So some boards, some volunteer activities, a bit more travel, a bit more exercise, and still exploring.
So, I love how concisely you've told that. And I love as a former, well, tech executive, you've broken it down into stages of software releases. When you and I first met, you shared a couple of things with me that perhaps your career wasn't necessarily intentional. But as I pulled some of those themes apart with you, I felt like there were some really clear sort of phases in there. And I would be summarizing it as swimming, Asia, and the internet. So let's go into a bit more detail about those phases in your career, whether they fit in one, two, or three, I'm not sure.
Okay, well, I think what you pulled out is a list of the things that made me make career changes. And the interesting thing when I talk to a lot of people, I get a lot of people who come to me for mentoring just because I've been around for a while. And often they want to be very purposeful in their steps. And I really applaud that. But I also try to point out that often if you have a reason to do something, but it isn't necessarily career related, it can lead to good outcomes.
Mm.
So the examples you're pointing out are in the first case, when I was younger, the only exercise I knew how to do was to swim. And so when I moved to New York for a banking job after college, and that was just pre-BCG, there weren't a lot of places to swim. And, it's very crowded. There's not a lot of land. And the only place that I could swim laps of any length was the pool at New York University in the Village near where I lived. And the only way to get to swim was to take classes. And so I had to sign up for some classes in order to access the pool. I thought, well, someday I'm going to get an MBA.
Yes.
But I had intended to go to Stanford, which is near where I grew up. And so I'll just take a class or two and have access to the pool. And ultimately, I ended up getting my MBA at NYU so that I could swim laps and access the pool. And I stayed at the bank because I liked my job there. And when it came time for my next sort of, I don't know, fulfilling a desire, which was I had always wanted to live in Asia, and I didn't have Asian language skills. So I thought I needed to go someplace close by where English was the main language. And of course, I should have been more persistent. I could have gone to Hong Kong or Singapore, and somehow I didn't investigate enough. But I thought, okay, I'm going to get a job in Australia. And when I looked for jobs, one of the options was to be a consultant.
Mhm.
And what did you need to be a consultant? At that time, you had to have an MBA. And why did I have an MBA? Because I had gone swimming.
Because you had to swim.
Yeah, because I like to swim. So there I was, and I was able to get a job at that time in Australia, it was PSEC, Pappas, Carter, Evans and Coop, which was a spinoff of both McKinsey and BCG, and then eventually went back to BCG. So the theme you saw there was I ended up in consulting because I wanted to go to Asia, not necessarily because I had picked consulting, which at that time I knew nothing about as a career. And then later on, many years later, I was living in the Bay Area, and I guess we'd already had the first internet bust, and then it was coming back in the early 2000s. And I really thought, I'm missing out on this internet thing. I really didn't know much about it, and I was quite senior in financial services, but I thought I'm really, other than using the internet a bit, I'm not understanding this industry, and I want to know more. And so then that last pivot was driven by me having, well, I guess a sense of FOMO before it was coined, or on a positive side, we could call it curiosity about what was going on in online media, what kind of industries was the internet spurring, and that's how I got into tech.
Well, how did you actually get into tech though? Because you wrote a letter, I think I recall.
Yes, so I was working at Visa, running the commercial card for Visa International, and as part of that, we wanted to do a piece of work or joint venture with Google. And through that, I met a man named Vint Cerf, who is one of the true founders of the internet. And he is still an evangelist at Google. And we met in a business setting, and there were business letters to write, emails, not real letters anymore. And I thought about it for a couple of weeks because I wanted to talk to him about Google and the internet, quote unquote. Yeah. But I thought that might be not the right thing to do, given that I was talking to him about business. So I sat on it, and then I thought, well, look, the worst thing that can happen is that he doesn't answer. And I guess the very worst is that he says to my boss at Visa, do you know that this woman wrote a letter to me? So, and I really figured nobody would bother to do that. So I wrote an email and said, hey, I love financial services and I'm keen to close this Visa Google deal, but I'm also interested in perhaps working at Google or a tech firm like that. What do you think? Would you be willing to speak to me? And he said, well, send me your resume. And that was, in the end, the beginning of how I went to work at Google. And so something that I wrote about in my book was what is serendipity? Because many people talk in their careers about serendipity. And I think there's a famous story of Kate Moss being discovered in an airport. And I'm still waiting for somebody to discover me as a senior model, I go through Changi a lot, if anybody's interested,
You're in
or
a lot of airports. That's true.
Sydney Airport. Yeah, yeah. If you're a travel addict, you're in a lot of airports. So I'm still waiting for that serendipity. But in the meantime, I think there's a lot of serendipity is really opportunity plus action. It's serendipity that I met Vince Cerf, but he wasn't going to just randomly ask everybody he met in any meeting if they wanted to work at Google. So
Hmm.
what made it serendipity was that I met him and then I took an action, which was I thought, okay, maybe it's a bit inappropriate or audacious, but I'm going to try. I'm going to ask him about working at Google. And so a lot of times, and I don't know the serendipity that I missed because I didn't do anything about it, or I can't think of it. But for a lot of people, they're kind of close, but they don't take the action. So I really think as people are going through their careers, and one of the things I've learned is seize those opportunities when you have it. But going back, yeah, I wrote a letter and it was the beginning of a lot of conversations with Google and ultimately my joining them in Singapore.
Do you know, someone said to you, and I wondered if it was to do with this move. Remember you telling me that someone said you were brave?
Oh, yes, I think it was a code for foolish. When I took the opportunity to go to Google, I probably took, I don't know, three um, rungs or four of title down,
Hmm.
from a fancy senior executive vice president to director, because that's what the internet companies were doing. And I took a salary cut, but I got equity, so that was a bet.
Mm.
And yeah, she said I was brave, and maybe I was, but I think I was just super curious. And I was a little nervous. Am I doing the right thing? Am I going to be able to understand this new industry? I'm certainly older than a lot of people who are working there. And is that going to be awkward? But I was really excited.
Mm.
And of course, the move paid off in spades, both financially in terms of the equity, but also the career change and the ability to do many of the jobs I did after, as well as the board seats.
So, how did you then navigate between, so it was Google, Twitter, and Cloudflare, right? The organizations.
Yes.
So,
You
how
mean
did yeah, how
go
did you
from one
navigate
to the
all?
next?
Yeah, absolutely. What
Well, I
motivated?
think the typical ways that people go from one to the next, somebody calls you to have a discussion. I became known for being either the first or a very early leader on the ground for US tech companies, understanding the lay of the land in Asia, how to build teams here, how to go to market across the region. And you probably are aware, but like in many cases, one early company spawns a whole lot of others. So Google was very early in the internet, Yahoo as well, and a lot of those people went on to staff uh, Twitter, Facebook, now Meta, even Airbnb and Twitch, because those people knew how to build online businesses, particularly ones that came, for example, with advertising, or from the tech side, how to become solutions engineers or how to build the tech stack. And now we're seeing it again in a different context with AI, for example, with where anybody from OpenAI can be poached to go to the next large AI firm, or from Anthropic, from other AI firms.
Okay, so let's talk about 3.0. So the transition to the portfolio career, or as you said, working out what you want to be when you grow up. Tell us about the motivations behind that move. And I think COVID, you said, was part of the impetus or part of the period of time that occurred.
Yeah, well, when COVID hit, I had worked 40 years full time, evenly, and that seemed like a nice milestone. One of the major issues because of the restrictions on travel was that it was very hard for me to be able to see my kids,
Mm.
to be able to travel. I mean, they were young adults, so they were not, I wasn't leaving a toddler alone in an empty apartment, so it wasn't that dramatic, but I felt a bit hampered. And
Mm.
also, I lost a lot of the things I liked about my job. The things I love the most are working with people, being with clients, and travel. Getting the revenue on the board and, building the business, that's all part of it. But the actual day-to-day activities that I mentioned are what I lost. And I thought, you know, maybe it's time to try something new. And I had already been on boards and I had thought about writing a book. So I thought, okay, let's try a different path. And I had been approached to teach a class. So I thought, hey, let's try um, having more flexibility, which would allow me at that time to be able to do quarantines and see my children who couldn't come back into Singapore because they weren't citizens, and explore what I might like to do. And so that's what I did. And
Mm.
that's when I
So, talking about boards, then, I'd love to get your perspective, and I'm asking the other board directors in the series as well. How do you tell when a board and a management team are functioning well? And what does it look like when they're not?
Well, I think that's a good question and something all board directors should be on their toes about all the time.
Mm.
I think telling when a board doesn't function well, I think there can be two real keys. One is nobody ever says anything in terms of disagreement at the board. That would suggest to me that people don't feel comfortable giving their opinion, which is not good. The reasons you have a mix of people on boards and not just one person is to get a variety of opinions. So if no one ever disagrees with each other, I think people are afraid of saying what they think. And even if they're not afraid, I would say it's still a risk that you've got complete groupthink.
Mm.
The board is so homogeneous that there's no outside opinions. The other more obvious one is you're arguing all the time and can't make any decisions because you can't get the board to agree, or everything is coming to a vote of 4-3 or 3-2 or something like that. I think management not functioning is a little bit easier because we're sort of sitting over them. I mean, we're not management, but as a board, you can see if people aren't getting along, especially if the CEO is transparent with you. And that's hopefully, the CEO sees you there to support them, not to uh, sort of malign them. And of course, sometimes the board will disagree with the CEO, but hopefully the CEO feels coached and supported and sometimes disagreed with, but enough comfortable enough with the board to tell you what's really going on.
Mm.
And I guess the other risk for the board is the CEO is not at all comfortable and you're not getting the truth and you need to ferret that out.
I'd love your reflection on this. Like talking to some CEOs, I mean, that CEO board relationship is critical. I mean, that's a very obvious statement. But some CEOs, and it differs across a whole range of different sectors, but can end up with directors who are not terribly experienced directors as well. And sometimes I hear feedback that they feel like the board can be there to find the gotcha moments.
So, my view would be it's not a board that helps that much. Although on the other hand, given the amount of regulatory scrutiny, given the amount of, you think about things that have gone wrong all over the world, and particularly in Australia, for example, with cyber attacks or release of, PII. I do think boards have to look very hard for, have we covered this off? Have we
Yeah.
covered that off? Are you sure that we are safe on this? So some of that might come across as gotcha, but I think it's genuine board nervousness and valid concern for shareholders and for stakeholders that the company is doing the right thing and has really taken the utmost care to do what's important. On the other hand, if it's just gotcha, I'm not sure that's a great relationship. What I see is the CEO board relationship has its roots in the CEO chair relationship. That's probably the most important because they talk to each other the most. And then that leadership will spill over to the board in terms of, how does the board work with the CEO?
What do you look for in CEOs today? I mean, it's such fast moving pace of change and things like that for everybody. What do you consider when you're looking for a CEO?
Well, so I think this is, I don't, the timing of this podcast was set up ages ago. But interestingly enough, for those who know me, I am on the board of Tyro Payments, and our CEO resigned this week to
Oh,
take
wow.
an amazing offer that's in his hometown.
Yeah.
So he's delivered really well for us, but he is leaving. And so this is very top of mind for me and for our board and for all of the headhunters who have called in the last 24 hours to volunteer their services to help us find a new CEO. So, there are so many things we look for, both in boards and CEOs, and for any, top exec. I think there's resilience,
Mm.
the ability to lead through a lot of difficult change, the ability to make tough decisions and bring their leadership team along with them, the ability to not only help set strategy, but really execute on it. It's one thing to have a great vision, it's another thing to actually be able to deliver.
Mm.
I think EQ is really important, even and maybe especially as we work from home and work remotely, and there are fewer opportunities to actually interact with staff and with partners and with stakeholders. I wrote an article for Forbes a couple years ago called "Is the CEO the chief?" I can't remember what I call it, emotional or something like that officer as opposed to executive officer. And it was my most viewed article ever, all about, CEOs really needing EQ. So I think those are a few of the things. And I suppose another, element that's overused, particularly in tech, but is growth mindset. I mean, really, they need to keep learning, keep thinking, be open to other ideas. I think the whole, the reason we have boards comprised of different people and then executive management teams comprised of different people is that every voice is important. People bring different experience, different expertise, and you want to be open to an aha moment that didn't come from you,
Mm.
and say, yeah, um, Joe or Sally or Bing or, Shachi just came up with an amazing insight that I think could help us in the business that isn't one I would have come up with.
So, and you're right, the timing is absolutely interesting, and you'll be well into a process of sorts by the time the listeners are hearing this, and you may well have made a decision. So, but one question that occurs to me is, I guess there comes a choice, right? There becomes a choice of an experienced CEO or a choice of elevating someone from a succession planning perspective. I'm not going to ask what you're going to do because I'm sure you don't know yet. But what I would ask is if you go the succession planning route and you end up with a new CEO, what do you think about board's role in nurturing those CEOs? Everyone starts in that role sometime in their career.
The current CEO, John Davey, who was amazing, was elevated. He was the CEO of a much smaller firm we had bought in health payments, which has become Tyro Health. So he was the internal successor when Robbie Cook left. And in many ways, because he'd been the CEO of a smaller firm, he understood being a CEO, but it was not public. And so there was a lot he had to learn. And there are lots of things you can do. You can offer coaching from the chair. You can offer outside coaching, which many firms do. And you can be, if they want it, more, offer more as a board if they'd like to have outside discussions. When I was put on my first board, which was InvoCare many, many years ago by Ian Ferrier, who some people might know, he said, the problem with people like you, I was at Google at the time, is that you're operators and you come on boards and you think, you know stuff and you want to get things done. And that is not your role on the board. Your role is to, think through things at board meetings, help the CEO, ultimately to hire and fire the CEO, to represent the shareholders, but you are not management.
Mm.
But if the management would like your help and they ask you, then yes. And so all the boards I've been on, we have worked with the CEO and said, hey, if someone wants to, so for example, at InvoCare, one of the reasons they put me on the board is they were just exploring, it sounds funny, digital in funeral homes, but we were entering digital advertising. People do live stream funerals. There were other aspects of using online media. And so at that time, the new marketing person, and then we actually hired a chief digital officer, would occasionally wanted to talk to me about, hey, how can I do this? Or can you get help? What do you think? So we always did it with the CEO's knowledge, and we were available for that. Or I was available for the CEO then, who was Andrew Smith, who's now at Ramsey, to talk. So those are different ways you can participate or support or provide support to a new CEO if they want it. And obviously your obligation as a board is, if the CEO is not asking for support, not getting it, and not doing their job, then you will need to point that out in terms of metrics they're not meeting, or, you might see it in pulse scores or, of the employee health, or you might see it in NPS scores of customer health, but hopefully it doesn't get to that. Most CEOs get there because they're curious and they want to elevate themselves. And I always think the best of people to start, that they're there because they want to do a good job and they want to learn. And so you're there to support that.
Absolutely. You shared some fantastic insight there into advice you were given, as an exec stepping onto a board and what the board's role is. I wonder, are there other points of time in your career where you heard feedback from someone that was really difficult to hear but ended up being really insightful for your career? Can you think of anything?
I have been given feedback over the years in various ways. I think very early on, the word hysterical was used, emotional. And I've had a lot of trouble over the years figuring out, and well, not trouble, I guess I've spent a lot of time thinking about how much of that is real and how much of that is being a woman in industries where there aren't or weren't a lot of women. I think things have gotten a lot better, both in consulting and tech. I was the first female partner for across Asia Pacific at BCG. I mean, we were very small at the time. And so I've learned to think of it in a couple ways. I think part of it, wherever there's the quote, wherever there's smoke, there's fire. And actually, J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye, who's very famous in the US, maybe less so in Australia, but I think people have read him, had a quote in Franny and Zoe called "Wherever there's smoke, there's strawberry jello," that I've always remembered because it doesn't make any sense, but I've loved it. But anyway, wherever there's smoke, if you get repeated feedback that you're emotional or whatever, there's something there. And I think for me, I've learned to interpret it this way and to work on it this way. The bottom end of being emotional, the showing stress, I tried never to snap at people, but I think people could see when I was stressed or nervous, is very unproductive. It's very scary to staff if their boss or leader is nervous or worried, and it helps no one. Yes, it may give a sense of urgency, but it's not a productive urgency. And so I've really had to learn to get rid of that, to not show that stress to anyone else. I wouldn't say I'm perfect, but I'm better. The upside of that, the super motivation, the energetic, the cheerleader part, I don't want to get rid of that. Over the years, the feedback's been terrific. My teams love it. People are motivated. They see where they're going. They feel they're cheered on. I think that positive feedback to reinforce the things people are doing well, as opposed to mostly negative critique of what isn't going well, is so powerful. And so I'm actually in the middle of a kind of coaching some other executives now, where part of the template they were given was come up with something to punish yourself when you're not doing the right things. Take away your morning coffee, buy coffee for everybody else, kind of little, not, it's not self-flagellation. But to be honest, I'm finding that if I work with them to say, wow, let's figure out, one of them took a step where they said, that action that I did changed the way we met and probably helped us make a better decision. And I think we saved 3 weeks of time. To me, that feels so much better than saying, hey, okay, I made a mistake. I'm going to buy coffee for everybody. I mean, you can do that too. But so I've kept that very positive, upbeat side of me, which is for me natural. It's not natural for everybody. But in terms of that feedback, that's how I've tried to ingest it. So it was difficult to hear. I do think part of it was very real. And so I work on it. The feedback I was never given that I wish I'd been given, that I give all the time now. I've written a couple articles about it. It was not my idea. You can read about it, but I did write about it in the book, is build a personal board of directors.
Love it.
You and I have been talking about a corporate board of directors. Usually when you get to a search, you've got some sort of matrix which says, okay, at this point, given who we are, we need somebody who, we would like somebody who understands the real estate industry, really knows Europe, and has a tech background,
Yeah.
for example. So you get to this kind of matrix area. And the reason we do that is because no one person can manage the whole board and can bring every level of expertise. So we spend a lot of our careers looking for a mentor or a sponsor. I do think we need a sponsor at work, maybe a couple sponsors at work who say, hey, we have a few people up for promotion. Melissa has been waiting. She's really good. I've seen her do this. It's her turn. You do need somebody doing that in an organization. And it's great to have a mentor, somebody who in some ways feels responsible for helping you. But that mentor only has one person's experience.
That's right.
What if you had an informal board of directors, 6 people, 5 people, 8 people, if you really want it, who get to know you over the years, who you talk to, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a year. They don't need to know you're on your board. I think that's that's awkward language. Like, hi, Melissa, will you be on my board?
Yes.
I'm not going to pay you. You're getting no remuneration. Good thing is you have no financial responsibility. But the difference when you ask advice from somebody who's like, I'm informally on what I would now call the board of directors for a lot of people, many of whom I've known for years. That great part about that is when they call to ask a question, I know who they are. I know what they're like. I know a bit about them. I can ask some questions that might spur their thinking or maybe even give some advice based on years of knowing them. I don't have to be their best friend. And in fact, for many of them, I have some distance. And I think that's much more helpful. You can go to your mother, you can go to your friends or your dad or your husband or your wife, but often they're too close. They're the ones who are going to go, yeah, that sucked. They were mean to you. You're fantastic. It'll
Yeah.
happen next time, right? But they don't have enough distance to maybe ask a question. So I was never given that advice, and I give it all the time now.
Mm. I'm going to assume at some point along the way you did do that for yourself, but I won't ask. It could get awkward. You'd have to name people and then they'd know.
I won't name names, and I don't think they know, but I did do it. Maybe I started doing it maybe 8 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
There's somebody who's a very senior board member in Asia who knows a lot more about Asian boards and life in some of these countries than I do. There's a younger person who I know from a tech firm who's knows a lot more about how people 20 to 30 years younger than I am think and how they might process some decisions or some incidents. So those are 2 examples.
Fantastic. So I feel like you've answered this as we've gone through, but I just think it's relevant for every board director. How do you stay relevant? And how do you help the companies that you are on the boards of? How do you help them do the same?
Well, I can only hope that I'm staying relevant. I think that is a really big question for those of us who aren't in the throes of the day-to-day sort of cut and thrust. And even for people who are, they might not be staying relevant in what they want to do. If you're working on a legacy system and what you want to do is, engineering for AI, then, you have to do things outside. So I think they're the obvious answers. Take courses. I've taken some online courses. Experiment. So, with AI in particular, I think a lot of us are, try Claude, try Perplexity. I'm a little scared of DeepSeek because of the geopolitics at the moment and what's going on. So I haven't experimented with that yet, but maybe I'm old fashioned. try Copilot, see what works better for you, make sure you know how to use these things and don't just use them for what do you think of this decision, get it to write stuff for you. Although, for example, Forbes is very strict. You can't write articles using AI and they're checking that.
Mhm.
I think you learn a lot during meetings. I advise a couple companies. This afternoon, I'm going to a meeting where they are explaining their AI product to one of their customers. And I just think by being there and listening to the customer questions and listening to the team cover cover issues, I will learn something from that. I don't need to be at that meeting, but I've been invited, so I'm going to attend.
Mm.
Um, I'm harping on AI here. It could be cybersecurity. It could be climate change. I think those are three of the big, really prevalent, broader issues. Could be psychological safety. For management, trying to ask the questions, how are you doing this? How are you thinking about it? Because then you both learn as a board director and push the management to learn, but it's hard. I think that's the biggest question for directors. And it's, one of the reasons people say like 9-year term is a limit because you're not independent. But I also think it's because you need new blood, you need new people, you need ways. It's great that people know the company, but you also need new ways of thinking.
Mm.
Some really big boards to do this leave their boards in place, but get advisory subcommittees. So for a little while, I was on a digital subcommittee for the digital advisory committee for the tech subcommittee of the ANZ board.
Right.
So they were trying to say, I think we want to leave the board as it is, and we even want our subcommittees as they are, but we want some new input. So different boards have different ways of approaching that, but I think it's the most important question. How do you know? Because it's how do you know if you're guiding the company well?
Mm. Do you have a sneak peek of what Aliza 4.0 is looking like, or are we too far away from that yet?
I think I'm still grappling with 3.0. Each of those other seasons were sort of 20 in the 20 years category, 15 to 20 years, and I'm only 4 years into 3.0.
You're just
So
warming up.
I'm still in the learning, taking suggestions. We didn't talk about, so I launched mentor walks in Singapore. I think I've learned some things that I don't think I'll write another book. It was interesting, but it probably wasn't my passion. I do think boards are my passion. Finding ways to scale mentoring, I'm passionate about. I do still mentor people, but you only have so many hours in the day. Uh, I don't think I'm going to give up travel, by the way. I think travel has been a part of each of those. So yeah, I'm still in 3.0. Where are you, Melissa? If you put it that way, which one are
I'm
you in?
yeah, I'd say I'm in 3.0 as well, which is really, it's a really lovely place to be. I think there's a lot more, I was going to use the word control, but that's not right. There's a lot more flexibility to kind of really, I don't know, get into the things I love. I think that's the way I look at this phase of my life. Not in the hustle and bustle of the executive space all the time anymore, and able to maybe pursue some curiosities and passions a bit more than I did in that stage. And I'm not looking at 4.0 either. I'm like you. I'm just warming up in this phase. So
Right.
I would love to ask you the final question I ask everybody in these conversations, and that is, what does brave feminine leadership mean to you, and do you think it needs to change?
So this one, you did give me a heads up for this,
I
and I
did.
have been thinking about it, struggling with it. I don't even know, like, why is the question, I know it's your title, but why is it like feminine and not female? What does feminine mean? Because for me, feminine comes with some interesting connotations of like maybe even gloves and lace and high heels. And I'm not sure that goes with leadership. But if I just look at sort of gender leadership, McKinsey did this study in like 2007, so it's really old now. I don't know if you ever saw it, but women apply more in leadership. They came up with these like 11 categories of leadership, and they looked at who does what more. So women in these leadership categories, people development, managing expectations and rewards, and role modeling behavior, much heavier amongst women. Doesn't mean men don't do it, but heavier amongst women, more women do more. The ones that more men do more are individual decision-making and control and sometimes coercive action, which it comes with negative connotations. Maybe it's not always bad. Equally were intellectual stimulation and effective communication, and a little bit more heavily women, but not as skewed as I said before, were inspiration and participative decision-making. So if I take, having grown up mostly professionally as a consultant, I liked fact-based. So I like that McKinsey fact-based. And of course, I'm sorry that it didn't come from BCG, which is my passion and where my heart is, but I'm happy to include other consulting firms. If that's feminine leadership, brave feminine leadership, I like that. Focusing on people, focusing on expectations, focusing on participative decision-making and inspiration. I'll take that any day. And being brave enough to do that and stick with it. And maybe even in my case, if I was a bit brave, a la foolish, to make some decisions based on curiosity. Yeah, I'm good with all that.
Aliza, I love that response. So thank you so much for taking the time to actually deeply think about it, which is, I think, what's come through in that response there as well, from initially something that you felt didn't quite connect or link. So that was wonderful. It's been an absolute pleasure having you join me as part of the conversation, Aliza. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It was really interesting, and I like listening to your podcasts, and I hope other people will enjoy this one.